In 1997, Benko and Strohmeyer said, "Never before in the history of the world have non-places occupied so much space." When liminality is mentioned in journal articles, it's usually in the context of anthropology. Liminality, in terms of anthropology, is a period of ambiguity where a person is stuck in between the phase of no longer and not yet. But nowadays, if you mention liminality or liminal spaces, the first thing people tend to think of is this. There's just something about a space that's in between that unsettles a really deep part of ourselves. Maybe it's because we, as humans, recognize when a place doesn't want us to stay there for long. There's something about its structure, usually claustrophobic, barren places, that warns us to get out quickly. Liminal spaces are present in every single horror movie because it's such an easy and effective way to instill unease in your audience. I think when you talk about liminal spaces, you can't not talk about the backrooms. And I don't think it needs any in-depth introduction. Even if you're not a horror fanatic, the backrooms is just everywhere. You can find an entire wiki dedicated to the lore of the whole thing. Kane Pixels made a really successful YouTube video series based on the backrooms, and there are many games that borrow the concept of it with varying degrees of success. What I'm trying to say is that liminal spaces are really just everywhere, and in really unique ways that some people might not even consider as liminal space. Bjorn Thomason's Revisiting Liminality, The Danger of Empty Spaces, defines liminal spaces as 1. A threshold, a doorway, a line or border that separates spaces. 2. Border areas or zones like airports or the no man's lands between nations. 3rd, large regions and continents such as the Mediterranean. And lastly, the parts and or openings of a human body. Bjorn Thomason is an anthropologist and sociologist, and this text of his is in a more social and cultural context. But this particular text of his can also be used to identify, contextualize, and expose empty spaces in horror. The most recognizable use of liminal spaces in horror is the visuals of empty, isolated spaces that normally should be occupied with people. Liminal spaces in horror tend to be finding the abnormal in normal places, perverting the familiar places that we usually don't think twice about. Every single horror movie ever has used liminal spaces in some way. Even The House of the Devil, made in 1896 by George Méliès, which is widely considered as the first horror movie ever made, utilizes liminal spaces by using a corridor as the background. But in this video, I want to focus on multiple genres of horror, starting with slashers. More specifically, I want to talk about Halloween, the first version in 1978. I love horror movies, and I always at least try to make an effort to watch the popular classics, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Saw, Final Destination, and so on. Halloween is one of the movies I watched recently, and it wasn't really that scary. Back then, Halloween was such a big deal because John Carpenter was a genius who used whatever limited budget he had to make a successful, suspenseful film, and it predated a lot of other slasher films that followed. There's still a certain level of respect there, but looking back on it now, it's not really that scary, especially that one scene where Michael Myers was wearing a sheet and pretending to be a ghost. Halloween was one of the few rare horror movies back in the days to be shot in 2.39 anamorphic aspect ratio, meaning more of the landscape is shown, leaving Laurie, the main protagonist, constantly alone in a sort of directionless empty space. And it gives this uneasy feeling to the audience even when Laurie is walking around in broad daylight, because in such a large amount of liminal spaces, we know she's not safe. When I watched Halloween, it was on a rare night of silence in my family house. My siblings and my dad all went to bed early, and only me and my mom watched the movie together in the dark near midnight. It was the perfect atmosphere to immerse myself into the film, and even though the story beats and scenes aren't necessarily scary now, Halloween left me with a distinct feeling that I can only get after I just woke up from a dream. This scene in particular, where Laurie runs around in a desolate neighborhood trying to find help, struck me so deeply because it looked like something ripped directly from my most weirdest vivid dreams. Everything looks so empty, so bare but perfectly preserved. There's no wear and tear, there's still cars in the driveway, the lawn is trimmed, but there's nobody around. This itself is the essence of what we think of liminal spaces now. But there's more ways in which liminality can manifest itself in the horror genre. When we think of body horror, we don't tend to think about how it connects to liminal spaces. But with more in-depth analysis, the correlation starts to make more sense, which leads me to want to talk about the 2016 body horror movie, The Autopsy of Jane Doe. The Autopsy of Jane Doe is one of those horror films that I watched without knowing what I was watching. For a bit of context, my family used to buy a lot of CDs, DVDs of movies, and just stack them there in front of the boxy TV we used to have. I wasn't a very supervised kid, so I would just put in the discs without even checking to see what might be inside them. And by the time I started watching, it's already a bit too late. I didn't know the movie I was watching was horror, and when Austin and his father Tommy begins their dissection of Jane Doe's corpse, I was disgusted, but I couldn't turn off the TV. Julia Kristeva, and I'm sorry if I butchered that, a French philosopher, defines abjection as something that is rejected or excluded because it threatens to disrupt the boundaries between the self and the other, the self being the subject and the other being everything outside of the self. In other words, abjection is associated with what is considered disgusting, unclean, or unacceptable because it blurs the line that we rely on to define who we are as individuals and as a society. And because abjection is something that establishes a boundary, it also counts as a liminal space. That's what I felt when I watched The Autopsy of Jane Doe. This feeling of disgust, but also curiosity at what's happening on screen. Elaborating on Kristeva's theory, Sarah Manette relates the abjection towards liminality to society's abjection of women's bodies. Jane Doe's corpse is the liminality in this movie. Her body is cut open, the quote-unquote doorway between the secrets she's keeping inside and the unsuspecting outside world, and her dead body examined, exhumed, studied. The liminal space contained inside her is violated, and because of that, she takes her due from her violators. Contrary to the physical and grotesqueness of liminal spaces in bodies, liminal spaces in the mind are more difficult to describe. Everyone knows Key and Peele, the comedy series, and when Jordan Peele made his directorial debut with Get Out, a psychological thriller, a lot of people were skeptical because the genre of the movie doesn't really fit his public image. But my god, was it a good movie. I watched Get Out only recently with my boyfriend, and I went into it without much expectations, not because I doubted Jordan Peele, but because I just didn't know what to expect. At the end, the movie left me feeling stunned, shocked, confused. Well, not really. The entire movie shows Chris, a young black man visiting his white girlfriend's family. It's an unapologetically obvious critique of post-racial America, about how some white Americans turn towards this sort of toxic positivity when dealing with other races, and how that sentiment, that immediate and frequently weird switch up when dealing with the other ones, is still racism, just a newly, more socially acceptable, updated version of it. Focusing back on how this relates to liminality, in the movie, Chris is hypnotized and his consciousness is violently expelled to what's known as the sunken place inside his head. It's this really weird and creepy space where there's nothing but darkness, and everything outside is muffled, like instead of his ears, it's the inside of his skull that's filled with cotton. Although Bjorn Thomason never defines the mind as a space of liminality, I think this moment in Get Out is still a prime example of liminal spaces. Chris is losing his identity, suspended in the void where he can't do anything but watch as his body is about to be puppeteered around by some white guy who wanted his eyes. He is literally stuck in the in-between. Going back to quote one of Kristeva's sentences, not me, not that, but not nothing either. Chris, the subject, is not entirely annihilated, but he can't do anything about it. He is and he isn't. And this couldn't be represented better than with this empty, suffocating void of liminality. Okay, I'll admit my last two examples are a bit too abstract, if not just a little reaching. So let's go back to something a little bit more grounded. Usually, the idea of liminal spaces conjures up images of small empty corridors, barren hallways, and otherwise unfurnished living spaces that should be occupied. Or at least, that's my case. But since Bjorn Thomason lists entire continents as liminal spaces as well, it made me think, why not think a little bit bigger? Survival horror is one of my favorite horrors, honestly, and I credit a lot of that love to survival horror video games. I love Outlast, I love Resident Evil, and I love The Evil Within. I like the adrenaline and scare of running around in a large map, trying to either avoid or fight off the threats that linger around in those dark, dreary corners. My love for survival horrors aren't just limited to games, of course. I have a guilty pleasure for zombie movies, which are the poster child of the survival horror genre. It just feels so realistic to me. Because whether the character is haunted by a ghost or chased down by a serial killer, there's always that annoying part of me that has some smart-ass solutions to their problems. Oh, just move out if your house is full of ghosts, or get an AK and give the killer something to really cry about. But if the entire city or you went to shit, what can you do? A Quiet Place is also one of those movies I went into without any expectations. I wasn't really looking for a scare, just something to watch. And it had been on my list for a while too, so I thought, why not? The movie isn't scary in the sense that it lingers with you well after you watched it, but it's definitely a rollercoaster ride of emotions throughout its runtime. The biggest draw of A Quiet Place is its interesting lack of dialogue. The act of talking, or making any sounds at all in the movie, is a death sentence. And so the movie, for the majority of its time, is incredibly silent, which makes you focus on the environment much more. The entire time, we only get to see the Abbott family throughout the movie, and only once we get to see another human, and even then, the moment doesn't last long. What's fascinating about this movie's liminal spaces is that everywhere is a liminal space. The empty town at the start of the intro, the areas that they traverse through, even the paths of sand they walk on precariously outline them between survival and certain death. The farmhouse, although being their now permanent place of residency in the apocalypse, has this transient vibe. Like they won't stay here forever, like they should move on to somewhere else if they could. But where else could they go? Like all the examples I talked about before, they're all stuck in this permanent suspense and this feeling of will they, won't they. The reason why we, as humans, find the temporary state of liminality so unsettling is because the space itself is designed without the intention of keeping anything there in mind. You're not meant to stay there, you're meant to pass by as quickly as possible, go from your point A to point B, a clean-cut process. But when you're stuck there, forced into the in-between, it starts to feel ominous, maybe even hostile. Or maybe, more realistically, nothing at all. So that's it.